She was the most elegant woman Hollywood ever produced. She won an Oscar, a Tony, a Grammy, and an Emmy. She wore Givenchy like it had been invented for her body alone. She smiled at cameras across 4 decades, and the cameras never once captured anything that looked like pretense. She was, by every surface measurement, the most graceful person in any room she ever entered. And underneath all of it, underneath the elegance and the breakfast at Tiffany's and the little black dress and the image that has been reproduced on more posters and tote bags and coffee mugs than almost any other face in the 20th century, was a woman who had survived a Nazi occupation as a child, watched her family fracture in ways that never fully healed, and spent her adult life quietly, persistently carrying a weight that the grace was partly designed to conceal. The woman the world called the definition of beauty had spent her childhood learning what beauty costs when the world decides to take everything else. Have you ever built a version of yourself around what survived the damage and had the world mistake the surviving for the whole story? Have you ever watched people celebrate the composure and wished, quietly, that someone would ask about what the composure was made of? That question lives at the center of Audrey Hepburn's story, and the answer, when you look at it directly, changes everything you think you know about the image. It is the winter of 1944. Arnhem, the Netherlands. Audrey Hepburn is 15 years old. She is dancing. Not performing, dancing in secret, in a basement, for a small group of people who have gathered without making noise, because making noise in occupied Arnhem in the winter of 1944 is a form of risk. The Nazis have occupied the Netherlands for 4 years. The Battle of Arnhem, the failed Allied operation that left the city under tightened German control and brought starvation behind it, has just ended. The family has been eating tulip bulbs to survive. She dances in the basement. She dances well. She has been studying since she was a small child, and she is, already, technically gifted enough that the people who watch her in that basement believe, despite everything, that she is going to be someone. She does not know yet what she is going to be. She knows only what she has already survived. She is thin, thinner than a 15-year-old should be, thin in the way that wartime nutritional deprivation makes children thin, in a way that stays in the body's memory long after the food returns. She will be thin for the rest of her life. The world will call it elegance. But this story does not begin in the basement in Arnhem. It begins earlier, in a world that was about to teach a small girl lessons that no child should be required to learn. Pull back far enough from the film sets and the award ceremonies and the magazine covers and the posthumous legacy that turned her face into a symbol of a particular kind of feminine perfection, and you find the real beginning. Not the version the publicity materials constructed. The version that actually happened. In a European childhood that was repeatedly interrupted by the fractures of the 20th century. Audrey Kathleen Ruston was born on May 4, 1929, in Ixelles, a municipality of Brussels, Belgium. Her father, Joseph Victor Anthony Ruston, who would later add Hepburn to his name from a distant family connection, was a British subject of Austrian-Dutch descent. Her mother, Ella van Heemstra, was a Dutch baroness. On paper, the birth certificate of Audrey Hepburn looks like the beginning of a story about European aristocracy and international sophistication. The reality was more complicated and more painful almost from the start. Her parents' marriage was unstable in the specific way of two people who had married for reasons that became insufficient before the children were old enough to understand what was happening. Her father was a charismatic, unreliable figure, a man of strong opinions and weak commitments. He had, during the 1930s, become a sympathizer with the British Union of Fascists, Oswald Mosley's movement. He attended rallies. He believed, for a period, in things that the next decade would demonstrate were not simply wrong, but catastrophically wrong. He left the family when Audrey was 6 years old. He walked out, and he did not come back, and the abandonment was not the kind that softens with time and adult understanding. It was the kind that sits in a child's body as a question, what was wrong with me, that made him go that no subsequent evidence fully answers. Her mother took her and her 2 half-brothers to England. Then, in 1939, as war approached, she moved the children to what she believed would be the safety of her family home in Arnhem, in the Netherlands. It seemed at the time like a reasonable decision. The Netherlands was neutral. The war, perhaps, would not reach them there. It reached them in May 1940. The German invasion of the Netherlands lasted 5 days. The occupation that followed lasted 5 years. Audrey Hepburn was 10 years old when the Nazis arrived in Arnhem. She was 15 when they left. Those 5 years are not a footnote to her biography. They are the foundation on which everything else was built. Have you ever had something happen to you in childhood at an age when you had no language for it and no choice about it that you could never fully explain to people who weren't there? That lived in you not as a memory you could describe, but as a shape your whole life bent around? That is what those 5 years were for Audrey Hepburn. Not a chapter. The ground. The occupation changed her body, and it changed her understanding of what the world was capable of, and it gave her, at an age when children should be learning the opposite, a first-hand lesson in how quickly the ordinary can become catastrophic. She danced through it. This is not a metaphor. She literally danced, continuing her ballet studies because her mother enrolled her with a local teacher in Arnhem, Marova, who kept teaching through the occupation years. Dance was the thing that had structure when the world outside had none. It was the thing you could do in a basement without making noise. It was the container for discipline, when discipline was the only thing standing between her and the fear. She also watched things that 15-year-olds should not watch. Her uncle was executed by the Nazis, shot in retaliation for Dutch resistance activity. Her half-brother Ian was forced into labor in Germany. She witnessed the rounding up of Jewish residents of Arnhem. She has described, in later interviews, watching people being loaded onto trains and not understanding completely what she was watching, but understanding enough to know that the understanding was going to cost her something. The Dutch hunger winter of 1944 to 1945, the deliberate German blockade that caused a famine in the occupied Netherlands and killed approximately 22,000 people, left her with anemia, an edematous condition, and respiratory problems that would affect her health for years. She was surviving on what the family could find. She was dancing through hunger because the dancing was the only thing she controlled. She weighed approximately 90 pounds when the liberation came in May 1945. When she spoke about this period in later interviews, she was careful. She was always careful. She said she had been lucky. She said others had it far worse. She said she did not like to dwell on it. She gave the composure that the world had come to expect from her, and she gave it even when the subject was the occupation, even when the subject was her uncle's execution, even when the subject was watching people disappear from her street. The composure was real. It was also, by any honest reading, a strategy. A learned response from a girl who had discovered, in 5 years of occupation, that the maintenance of surface was sometimes the only form of control available to you. She carried that strategy into the rest of her life. It served her extraordinarily well. It also meant that almost no one, for most of her public life, got close to the weight underneath the surface. After the liberation, she pursued ballet. She trained seriously in Arnhem first, then in Amsterdam with Sonia Gaskell, then in London with Marie Rambert, the legendary figure of British ballet whose school attracted serious students from across Europe. She was good. Better than good. But she was also, and this must be named plainly, because it is part of the story, not quite good enough for the highest level of classical ballet. Her body, compromised by the war years, lacked the physical resources that professional ballet at the highest level requires. She was too tall for the corps. Her early malnutrition had imposed limits. Marie Rambert told her so. Not cruelly. Directly, she was told that a career as a professional ballet dancer was not likely to be available to her at the level she had imagined. This was a loss. Not a politely mentioned biographical inconvenience, a genuine loss, for a girl who had used dance as the container for everything the occupation had taken from her control, to be told that the container itself had limits imposed by the occupation's damage. She pivoted. Not defeated, pivoted. She began taking small roles in the West End. She appeared in chorus lines. She was cast in small film roles. She was, in the early 1950s in London, a working actress at the beginning of a career whose eventual scale was not yet visible, even to the people who could see that she was exceptional. She was cast in the Broadway production of Gigi in 1951, after Colette herself reportedly spotted her and suggested her for the role. Broadway opened something. The stage confidence that ballet had built, deployed in a different form, in front of American audiences who had not yet been told who she was, produced a reaction that her British film and stage work had begun to suggest. She won the Tony Award for Best Actress in a Play in 1954 for her role in Undine. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress in 1954 for Roman Holiday. In the same year, the same 12 months, the industry scrambled to find language for what was happening. The word that attached itself to Audrey Hepburn in 1954 and in every year that followed was luminous. People who met her in person reported a quality that photographs suggested, but could not quite capture, a quality of presence that had something to do with the attention she gave people. The way of listening that made the person being listened to feel that the listening was real and not performed. What the industry was seeing and what was actually beneath it were, as they so often are, not the same story. There is a version of Audrey Hepburn's story that the public was given across 4 decades of films and photographs and carefully managed celebrity. The version of Breakfast at Tiffany's and Sabrina and Roman Holiday and Funny Face and My Fair Lady and Wait Until Dark. The version that appeared in Vogue and Harper's Bazaar and on every red carpet as the definition of a certain kind of style, restrained, deliberate, built on the understanding that elegance is refusal as much as it is selection. Her partnership with Hubert de Givenchy, the French couturier, who dressed her from 1953 onward, and who became one of the most important personal and professional relationships of her life, produced the vocabulary that people still use when they talk about Audrey Hepburn's style. The little black dress. The ballet flat. The structured simplicity that looked effortless because the effort was hidden. Givenchy said that she taught him as much as he taught her, that her understanding of how clothing served the person wearing it, rather than the reverse, shaped his entire design philosophy. But the private life, running alongside the image, was not effortless. Her first marriage, to actor and director Mel Ferrer in 1954, produced a son, Sean, in 1960 after multiple miscarriages that she has spoken about with a grief that the composed public surface rarely revealed. She wanted children with a longing that had everything to do with the family that had fractured when her father left, and the childhood that the occupation had taken, and the specific hunger of someone who had lost safety early, and wanted, more than almost anything else, to build it back. The marriage to Mel Ferrer was, by the accounts of those close to her, complicated in the way of marriages between two strong-willed people, where one is significantly more famous than the other, and where the imbalance creates pressures that affection alone cannot resolve. He was possessive, some said. She was loyal, to a fault, others said. She stayed through the difficulty, and left finally, in 1968 when the difficulty had become something that staying was no longer serving. She married Italian psychiatrist Andrea Dotti in 1969. They had a son, Luca, in 1970. The marriage lasted until 1982. It was, by accounts that surfaced gradually over the years, troubled by his infidelities, troubles that she managed with the privacy and the composure that managed everything in her public life. And that cost her, privately, in ways that the composure concealed from almost everyone. Have you ever held yourself to a standard of grace under circumstances that the grace was not designed to handle? Have you ever maintained the appearance of a particular kind of dignity because the alternative, the visible crack in the surface, seemed somehow like a betrayal of something you had decided you were? That is the private story beneath the Givenchy. Not a small story. The hidden load-bearing wall of everything she presented to the world. The biggest reckoning of Audrey Hepburn's life did not arrive in a film role or a failed marriage. It arrived in the late 1980s, when she became a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador and walked back into the landscapes of hunger and war that her childhood had been built from. She had been approached by UNICEF in 1987. She said yes immediately. She has said, in interviews from that period, that she said yes because she understood from the inside what UNICEF's work was trying to address. She had been a beneficiary of similar relief efforts. After the war, she has spoken about receiving food from the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration after the liberation. About the specific memory of powdered eggs and condensed milk arriving as though they were the most extraordinary food in the world. She said yes because she was one of the children they were describing. She had been that child. Between 1988 and 1992, she traveled to Ethiopia, Sudan, Bangladesh, Vietnam, El Salvador, Somalia, Guatemala, Honduras, and other countries at the front lines of humanitarian crisis. She held children. She walked through camps. She sat on the ground with mothers who were watching their children die from preventable causes. She did not do this from behind a camera crew with a choreographed emotional reaction. She did it the way she did everything that mattered to her, with the full weight of her actual attention, with the quality of presence that people had been trying to name since 1954, brought now to bear on the faces of children who had nothing and who were being looked at, genuinely looked at, by one of the most famous women in the world. She was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1992, a few months before her death. She was also, by 1992, dying appendiceal cancer, diagnosed in September 1992. She had been experiencing abdominal pain during her final UNICEF mission to Somalia. She had attributed it to the rigors of the travel. The diagnosis, when it came, was advanced. The cancer was not caught early. She returned to Switzerland to Tolo Kenaz, where she had lived for years with her companion Robert Wolders for the final months. She died on January 20th, 1993. She was 63 years old. She had known, for 4 months, that she was dying. By the accounts of those around her, she spent those 4 months doing what she had done for 63 years, being present with the people she loved, in the manner that had always been her most consistent and least photographed quality. Not performing grace. Practicing it. Have you ever watched someone face the thing at the end with the same quality of attention they brought to everything else and understood for the first time that what you had always called composure was actually something deeper and harder and more earned than composure? That is what the people around Audrey Hepburn in those final months described. A woman who had learned, in a basement in occupied Arnhem, how to maintain herself under conditions that should have broken her. Who carried that learning across 60 years. Who used it, finally, in the last room. The accounting of what Audrey Hepburn's elegance concealed is not a small accounting. The father who left at 6, and whom she searched for, successfully, in the 1960s, finding him in Dublin, elderly, and spending years visiting him, providing financial support, trying to understand the man who had walked out on the 6-year-old, who would one day be on every magazine cover in the world. She never got the full explanation she was looking for. The father died in 1980. She attended his funeral. She said little about it publicly. The miscarriages multiple, across the years of her first marriage, that she has described as among the most devastating experiences of her life. The longing for family that had its roots in the family that the war and her father's departure had taken from her. The specific grief of losing pregnancies when what you are carrying in them is not simply a child, but the chance to rebuild what was taken. The 2 marriages that did not hold. The years of conducting herself through the complications of those marriages with a public surface that gave almost nothing away. The love that she found, finally, with Robert Wolders, a relationship that began in 1980 and that lasted until her death, and that those who knew them described as the quietest and most sustaining and most mutual thing in her adult life. A relationship that required no performance and no management, and that simply was what it was, in the years she had left. The central irony of Audrey Hepburn's life is this. The image that made her immortal, the composed, elegant, effortlessly graceful woman who became the benchmark for a particular kind of beauty, was built, originally, in a basement in Arnhem, out of the specific and costly materials of survival. The grace was not the opposite of the damage. It was made from the damage. And the world that consumed the image never fully understood what the image had cost to construct. In the years since her death in 1993, Audrey Hepburn has become something that few human beings become during their lifetimes, and almost none become in death: an idea. The face on the poster. The woman in the little black dress. The symbol of a kind of femininity that is offered, in the cultural recycling of her image, as timeless and aspirational, and in some way accessible. She would have been, if she were alive, 96 years old in 2025. Her son Sean Hepburn Ferrer and her son Luca Dotti have spent years after her death working to preserve her UNICEF legacy and to present a version of her that is fuller and more honest than the poster. Sean wrote a memoir that described the mother, not the icon. Luca has spoken in interviews about growing up in the shadow of a public image that bore only partial relationship to the woman he knew at home. The woman he knew at home was funny. She was, by accounts of those who knew her, genuinely funny, dry, self-deprecating, quick in the way that people who have survived serious things tend to be quick, because survival at that level has no use for pretension. She was also, her sons have said, uncertain about herself in ways the image never communicated. Uncertain about her beauty, she has said she never understood why people found her beautiful. A statement that is either false modesty or the honest report of a woman whose self-image was formed during years when survival, not beauty, was the operative category. Uncertain about her talent, she has described feelings of inadequacy on film sets that her Academy Award and her 4 subsequent UNICEF honors do not appear to have resolved. The uncertainty was real. The achievement was real. Both things were true simultaneously. That is, finally, the most human thing about her. Audrey Hepburn's story is not a story about elegance. It is not a story about Givenchy or breakfast at Tiffany's or the image that has been reproduced on more surfaces than almost any other face in the history of cinema. It is a story about what survival looks like when it learns to dress itself beautifully. About the specific and under-acknowledged costs of a childhood interrupted by catastrophe. About what it means to build a public self from the materials that remain after the world has taken everything it is going to take, and to have that public self so thoroughly admired that the construction process becomes invisible. It is a story about a girl who danced in a basement in Arnhem because dancing was the one thing she controlled, and about the woman she became who carried that basement with her into every film and every photograph and every moment of UNICEF fieldwork in Somalia and Sudan, and who never asked anyone to understand what she was carrying, and who was better understood for the carrying than she was ever given credit for. We celebrate composure. We call it elegance. We put it on tote bags. We rarely ask where it came from. What would change in how you see the composed people around you if you understood that composure is almost never a natural state? That it is almost always a thing built from something, from loss, from practice, from the specific discipline of a person who learned early that falling apart was a luxury unavailable to them. What would change in how you see yourself? Leave that in the comments, because that question is not about Audrey Hepburn. It is about the basement everyone is dancing in. If this story moved you, if something in it landed somewhere real, leave a like. It costs nothing. It means this story finds someone who needs it. Subscribe. More stories like this are coming, lives that looked perfect from the outside and were something braver from within. And tell me below, what is the one thing from Audrey Hepburn's life that stays with you? Because the most important performance she ever gave was not in front of any camera. It was in a basement in Arnhem in 1944, when she was 15 years old and thin from hunger, and the world was burning down outside, and she danced anyway. Because it was the one thing she controlled. We'll be back.